The snow had been falling steadily for several days, and had totally blanketed the sleepy corner of Vermont where the elderly couple lived. The moon shone in a clear black sky, its borrowed light spilling onto the fields below, amplified by the reflective nature of the flawless, crisp white snow. It somehow gave the impression that dawn was close at hand, but that was not the case. It was nearly 2 a.m. when the husband was unexpectedly awoken by the sound of persistent knocking, emanating from downstairs at the front of his property. Having arisen, he moved across to the window and looked outside to see who might be calling at this ungodly hour. There was no vehicle parked outside, or tracks of any kind imprinted in the virgin snow following the path leading to his front door. Shrugging his shoulders, he slowly made his way downstairs as his wife got out of bed behind him. Reaching the hallway, he opened the front door, and standing on the front porch, seemingly unperturbed by the freezing temperatures outside, were 2 children, a boy and a girl. Both were dressed in old-fashioned clothing with traditional haircuts, and neither seemed to want to make eye contact with him. Speaking in a slow and deliberate manner, the boy simply stated that their parents were coming to collect them, and asked if they could come in and shelter from the freezing cold weather. Their account was vague, but despite the old man's misgivings, his wife was quick to usher the 2 youngsters past him and into the front living room. The pair then settled themselves on the sofa, and both immediately became unresponsive, failing to reply to any of the couple's questions. There was something deeply unsettling about these children, which for some time the elderly man could not quite figure out. That was until he noticed that their eyes were entirely black, with no discernible pupil or iris. In an instant, he was overcome by a crippling feeling of dizziness and unease. As he collapsed backwards into an armchair, his wife gasped upon seeing blood pouring from his nose. She ran to the kitchen to grab a towel, and as she tried to staunch the flow of blood, all the lights in the house suddenly flickered and went out. A sing-song voice then pierced the darkness as the little girl announced that their parents had arrived. The 2 small shapes rose from the sofa, making their way to the front door and out of the premises. Waiting outside was a black, classic American car, with 2 men in dark suits standing beside it. They all left together. The couple remained huddled in the dark, terrified by what had just happened, until the lights mysteriously came back on about half an hour later. But the wider effects of this sinister visitation would take far longer to become apparent. Both husband and wife continued to suffer from dizzy spells and nosebleeds in the months following the incident. In addition, the old man was subsequently diagnosed with skin cancer, and of the couple's 4 house cats, 1 would be found lying on the sofa where the children had sat, having died of a hemorrhage. The other 3 simply vanished without trace. The mysterious and deeply unsettling phenomenon of the black-eyed children, who are also described as black-eyed kids or BEKs, was largely unheard of until the mid-1990s. It was at this time that stories involving these strange entities began to circulate online, prompting more and more internet users to come forward and share their experiences. But examples of people receiving unwanted visitations from BEKs stretch back far beyond this period. One of the earliest recorded examples of such an encounter dates back to 1950, when a 16-year-old boy living in rural Virginia returned home to his parents in a panicked state. Sobbing uncontrollably, Young Harold Whittaker had explained to his father that he had been walking home from school when he had noticed a boy of similar age leaning up against a nearby gatepost. This other boy had stepped out in front of him and said, "I want to go to your house. You will walk me to your house." Harold told his father that the youth's eyes had been pitch black and that he was suddenly overcome with a feeling of absolute fear and apprehension. He also remembered having the distinct impression that the other boy was somehow reading his thoughts. The black-eyed adolescent moved to block his path and ordered the terrified teen not to run, again demanding that he show him the way to his house. Harold related how he had suddenly become lightheaded and unable to think clearly. An uncomfortable suggestion began to form in his mind, urging him to comply, but he suddenly panicked and made a run for it. The last thing that Harold heard was an animal-like howl echoing behind him. The story that first brought the concept of BEKs into the public consciousness was posted online in 1996 by a man named Brian Bethel. A resident of Abilene in Texas, he had written about his experience that year. According to Brian, he was seated in his car on North First Street and had been writing out a check when there was an unexpected knock on the driver's side window. When Bethel looked up, he was surprised to see two boys standing alongside the vehicle, whom he guessed were aged about 9 and 12. When he wound the window down to talk to them, he was suddenly struck by their penetrating jet black eyes, which seemed to pierce his very soul when they came to rest upon him. Speaking in a monotone and emotionless manner, the eldest of the two informed Bethel that they had no money and needed a lift home. Utterly disturbed by their demonic appearance, Bethel made his excuses and told the boys he couldn't help them. They seemed to become visibly angry at this and urged him to let them into his car. Suddenly, Bethel noticed that his own arm was now reaching for the door handle, very much against his will. Intimidated by their intense gaze, he instead wound up his window, locked the car doors, and drove off into the night. As he accelerated away, Bethel looked in his rearview mirror, only to realize that the two boys had completely disappeared, as if they had never been there at all. Another, more recent encounter took place in the English county of Staffordshire in 2004. On the morning of the 13th of September, a husband and wife were walking their dog across the Cannock Chase Nature Reserve. They were proceeding along the main path near to an area known as Stile Cop, when they heard the unmistakable sound of a small child giggling, hidden within the confines of a tree line they were passing. The couple stopped and peered into the dark undergrowth, looking for the source of the laughter, when it abruptly ceased. After a time, they turned to resume their walk, but almost jumped out of their skin when they saw that a young girl was now standing a short distance away, blocking their path. She wore an old-fashioned white dress, but it was her emotionless and unblinking black eyes that held their attention. The girl stood stock still, regarding them with a somewhat unsettling smile on her face. She did not respond or move at all when they tried to speak to her. She simply stood there and stared back at them. It was only when the couple's dog cautiously ventured towards her that she turned and ran back into the trees, laughing to herself. When describing the haunting encounter to a local newspaper, the husband stated that throughout the incident, the girl had seemed to have her head cocked to one side. The angle it had been resting at looked uncomfortable and unnatural, almost as if she had been hanged with a rope or cord of some kind. The husband and wife are just two of many witnesses who have encountered this apparition at Cannock Chase, and the repeated sightings of the black-eyed girl have given rise to a number of theories about who this mysterious child might be. During the mid-1960s, a series of brutal killings took place along the route of the A34 road, and they would later become known as the Cannock Chase murders. The bodies of 6-year-old Margaret Reynolds and 5-year-old Diana Tift were found half hidden in a ditch at Manstey Gully in January 1966. Both girls had been abducted from different parts of the West Midlands whilst travelling to and from school several months prior. The following year, another body would be found less than a mile away, that of 7-year-old Christine Darby. The local constabulary would put hundreds of man-hours into trying to identify the killer, but it would not be until November of 1968 that the case finally received a breakthrough. Witnesses to the attempted abduction of a 10-year-old girl from a street in Walsall provided police with a car registration number, resulting in the arrest of a man named Raymond Leslie Morris. Morris was well known to the authorities for his obsession with young girls, and he had been one of the suspects interviewed in the disappearance of Christine Darby. Whilst he was being held in custody for the abduction, his wife admitted to officers that Morris had coerced her into providing him with a false alibi for the day of Darby's disappearance. He was eventually convicted of her murder and died in prison in 2014, becoming one of England's longest-serving prisoners. Despite never being convicted of the murders of Reynolds and Tift, it was long believed that Morris had been responsible for their deaths too, and the reports of a ghostly girl haunting Cannock Chase started to appear soon after his incarceration. Local residents believe that the black-eyed girl is the ghost of one of these victims, her young spirit unable to move on. The idea that these haunting individuals may be the spirits of deceased children does seem a convenient one, and some of the persuasive and repetitive behaviours of these so-called apparitions are similar to those associated with phantom hitchhikers. But the majority of cases involving black-eyed kids are either too isolated or bizarre in nature to trace back to a local ghost story. Some believe that rather than being confused or misguided spirits, these individuals are in fact possessed by a far more malevolent and divisive entity. To the ancient Celtic tribes of the United Kingdom, children with black eyes were believed to be otherworldly demons, who walked our plane of existence in search of blood rituals and sacrifices. Across the ocean in many Native American cultures, black-eyed people were thought to be similar to the Wendigo, in that they were the unfortunate victims of an evil entity with hostile intentions. The Iroquois referred to this spirit as the Otkon, a malevolent being whose goal was to infect key members of a tribe and gradually turn them all against one another, starting with the most vulnerable prey, the children. As recently as 2017, the inhabitants of a native Oglala reservation located at Pine Ridge in South Dakota asked for a shaman to visit and bless their encampment after having reported a series of encounters with BEKs. Over a period of weeks, strange children with haunting black eyes had approached the borders of their camp and tried to encourage the Sioux youngsters to play with them. Unsurprisingly, the camp's children refused to do so, finding the eyes of the newcomers soulless and terrifying. The strangers then focused on the adults of the reservation, asking for food and shelter in dull, monotone voices. When this was also refused, one of the children asked the horrified residents if they had any blood to spare, before they disappeared back into the trees. In the weeks afterwards, a number of pets went missing from the community, until the shaman's blessing seemed to end the matter altogether. In a significant number of encounters describing BEKs, such as the one in Vermont, Witnesses have described seeing the children meeting up with what are believed to be men in black. Sometimes these mysterious and intimidating individuals are seen driving the children around in their cars. In other situations, MIBs have either ushered the black-eyed children away or visited their victims in the aftermath of an encounter. This has naturally given rise to the theory that the children may be extraterrestrial in origin, or human children who have been abducted and assimilated in some way. The fact that they appear to possess some level of psychic persuasion and the ability to harm people they encounter suggests to some commentators that they are either participants in or escapees from a sinister government test program. Given the lack of overt hostility displayed during most encounters, and the fact that the phenomenon is quite recent in nature, there is also the possibility that this is little more than an urban legend or creepypasta. A certain percentage of the testimonies which have been published online is almost certainly little more than creative writing on the part of the author. On the other hand, it is relatively easy these days to purchase sclera contact lenses that completely cover the exposed areas of the eye. Many horror films have utilized them to terrifying effect. There are also numerous forms of medication where a widely expanded pupil is a common side effect. It is entirely possible that environmental conditions, such as street lighting, may give the impression that someone's eyes are completely black during an encounter. What is perhaps surprising about the phenomenon of the black-eyed children is the widespread absence of photographic or video evidence. Their legend has been precipitated in an age of smartphones and more advanced surveillance cameras, and yet alleged witnesses have not been able to capture a single piece of convincing footage. A subscriber recently contacted us regarding an encounter he had whilst working security at an abandoned building. One night, two young individuals approached the security fence surrounding the site, asking him if they could take shelter in the derelict building. At first, they had kept their eyes cast downwards, but when he had refused their request for safety reasons and proceeded to ask where their parents were, they had looked directly at him, revealing jet black eyes. The CCTV footage that the subscriber provided clearly shows that he is conversing with someone on the other side of the fence. He even visibly flinches at the point where he says they looked at him, and yet the CCTV cameras inexplicably fail to record their presence, making it appear as though he is talking to no one. Although intriguing, the video in itself offers no proof whatsoever. A common feature of the stories and accounts involving the supernatural make reference to the eyes of the creatures and entities involved being somehow different to those of a normal person. The overwhelming number of ghosts, aliens and monsters who have been described throughout the ages possess eyes that are devoid of a pupil or iris and consist of only one colour. These are usually red or black in appearance, colours most commonly associated with evil and malevolence. This means that stories involving children with black eyes can traverse different genres, such as ghost stories or alien abductions. And it is entirely possible that rather than being an isolated phenomenon, the concept of BEKs is simply a common horror trope that commentators are choosing to view in isolation. Regardless of this, the stories continue to come thick and fast, with these strange intruders displaying even more bizarre and unsettling behaviour. All we can say is, remember to keep your doors and windows closed and your camera phone handy should an insistent knocking suddenly occur in the early hours of the morning.